Hey everybody, RazorMouth for Trump the Media. So there's an old saying, you know it, don't piss on my parade and tell me it's raining. And that, I think, sums up exactly what's happening with the fake news media and all of their lackeys in the establishment Republican Party and elsewhere, and all the Joe Biden trolls that for some reason need to spew their venom even on our platform. They keep telling us just move on, don't worry about it. Our guy won legally. He's won. Time for healing, time to move on, time to get over it, right? Well, we all know that's just a falsehood. It's a lie. It's propaganda. Nothing has been decided at this point. And if the truth comes to the light of day, there's no reason to doubt that Donald J. Trump will prevail. But why are we in this situation? And I think that's an important question to ask. And I know that a lot of people have been pontificating, but I think one of the reasons we're in this state is because those of us on the right, didn't spend enough time to actually understand our opponent and the depth of fraud and lying that would take place. We didn't spend the time to really analyze their behavior. What am I getting at? Well, let's go back in time very quickly, just paint the context for you. If you remember, on November 3rd, the night thereof, a lot of the media, the alternative media, conservative news media, were pontificating about the ground game. Remember that? The ground game. Republicans had a ground game, we were told. This really came out when Trump took Florida, the state of Florida, and there were a lot of pundits. For instance, on Newsmax, Mark Halperin was one of them, talking about how the Republicans and the Trump team had a ground game. They were out there canvassing. They had boots on the ground, knocking on doors, signing people up, getting them registered, getting them to vote at the polling stations. And they talked about the apparatus with the rallies and how the Trump team was able to identify that between 20 to 30% of rally participants were Democrats who've come over to Trump. And then they also were able to identify a whole slew of independents and people who hadn't voted for decades coming out of the woodworks, all in favor of Trump. And so they pointed out how the Republicans had a ground game. And this is the reason why they've taken back Florida. And the juxtaposition was that the Democrats didn't have a ground game, that they were lazy, that they lacked enthusiasm. Remember that, the enthusiasm gap? Trump had energy, he had enthusiasm. Look at all the people coming out to his rallies. Where Biden, the Biden team, they didn't have anything. Now, most of us didn't question that narrative. Obviously, there's some truth to that. There's no doubt that Joe Biden has no energy. There's no doubt that Joe Biden spent most of his time in his basement, hunkering down. But I don't know if you're like me. I was questioning that narrative to some extent because while there may be some truth to the fact that Republicans had a ground game, I wasn't convinced that the Democrats didn't have a ground game. Certainly not a typical ground game like the Republicans, but I wasn't convinced. And the reason why is because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they looked way too easy going about it all. And the fact that the Biden team kept putting the lid on his campaign told me everything. They weren't worried. And I wonder why. Well, I think maybe it's time that we remind ourselves that often our opponents reveal their hand in the open, more so than we're willing to acknowledge. Do you remember this?
We're in a situation where we have put together, and you guys did it for our administration, the President Obama's administration before this. We have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
Come again?
The most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
Just so we get that right, one more time.
The most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
Okay. Now, at this point, the Biden trolls that happen to get on this platform are caterwauling. Oh, you're taking Biden out of context. Well, hold on. I've said nothing. I've just played you his words, right? I will admit that that is not what Biden wanted to say. I'll grant you that. There's no way that would be in the talking points or his notes, or that's not what he would have been coached to say. But this is what we call a Freudian slip. He may not wanted to have said that. That may have been an error in the statement, but it does reveal what's behind the scenes, the truth of the situation, the truth behind this veneer here. And that is that Joe Biden and his campaign staff and higher up operatives had high-level conversations discussing their ground game. And what was their ground game? That's exactly what he said here, that they've created a voter fraud network that is without pale, without precedent in the history of American politics. What am I getting at? Well, while the news media was focusing on COVID-19 and denigrating Trump as often as they could, they didn't spend any time actually exposing or telling us what the Biden team was actually doing under cover of night. Of course, they weren't doing anything under cover of night. It was there in the open for anybody to watch. But the news media, and I would even say even often the alternative right-wing media, didn't spend any time analyzing this ground game. The ground game of the Bidens, the Biden team, had basically three planks to it. The first was litigation. They spent a considerable amount of effort from the time that Joe Biden took over and became the candidate for the Democrats. They spent time litigating every battleground state they could to deal with the issue of mail-in voter ballots. If you go to the ACLU website, we're not going to go there right now. There's a statement on their website in the news section that deals with what they consider voter suppression on behalf of the Republicans, and they outline various things that they want to see changed. And this was near the start of 2020. In February, they released this on their website. Anyways, if you analyze that and read that, and I just encourage you to go do that on your own time, you'll discover that they spend a considerable amount of time litigating certain battleground states. And I want to bring to your attention this particular article here in thetime.com. And this one here, the headline says, Democrats just won several major lawsuits over mail ballots, but their fight continues. This was released on September the 18th, 2020. Let me just read one paragraph here for you. The second one in here, this one right here. It says, we are fortunate to have a system where an attorney general could walk into a courtroom and make the case to a federal judge and put a stop to this madness, says Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who led the coalition of attorney generals in a federal lawsuit that successfully procured a national temporary injunction against changes in the Postal Service. Now, what's he dealing with? Well, he's actually dealing with the way the Postal Service would deliver these mail-in ballots. But that's just one of many types of litigation that were taking place at the early turn of the 2020, in the springtime, the winter and springtime, when Democratic operatives were hiring law firms to go and basically sue various jurisdictions throughout the United States in the various state level to deal with those states, like, for instance, PA, where the legislature, the lower house, the state house, that is, which is basically run by Republicans, who had instituted certain parameters for dealing with mail-in ballots. And because of COVID, they've allowed for mail-in ballots as a means by which people could vote. However, recognizing that mail-in ballots could be abused, they put certain restrictions around it, really basic common sense restrictions that any right-minded person wouldn't object to. And some of these restrictions would be that the mail-in ballot would have to be in on the day, on a specific day. Most jurisdictions, it would be November 3rd, that had to be time-stamped by the Postal Service to indicate that it was in on that particular day. They wouldn't allow for extensions beyond a specific date. In the case of PA, they didn't want it to prolong and go past November 3rd. So these operatives, these Democratic law firms, or hired by Democratic operatives, went out and basically litigated in all these jurisdictions to allow for potential abuse to actually happen. They worked against these common sense regulations and rules to guard the election process. And so by doing and by winning these cases where they went, for example, where they go into a place like PA and they find themselves a federal judge who happens to be a Democratic hack, someone who's going to be sympathetic to their perspectives, they litigate and they get the judge to change the rules at the last minute. And by doing so, they created a framework which would allow for potential fraud to happen. Now, fraud hadn't happened yet. They simply just sued and changed the rules at the last minute. So that was the first prong of their ground game, right? Allow for the change of rules so we can allow for fraud. This is like, you're having a game, you're playing the game according to the rules, and at the last minute, you're behind the 8 ball, and you happen to be friends with the referee, and you guys decide to just change the game, the rule of the game, so that you can win surreptitiously. That's exactly what the Democrats do here. So that's prong number one of their ground game. The second part, and this is probably one of the most intriguing parts of their ground game, was the installation of big tech and social media giants to aid them in this development. Now, this is not what you might think it is. It's not about the suppression of free speech. It's something a little different. And Lou Dobbs interviewed John Solomons about this just the other night, and I want you to hear what he has to say. Let me just increase it for you here, and away we go, John.
Nuclear bribes, Russian spies, Washington lies that enriched the Clinton and Biden dynasties. It's great to have you with us, John. Let's turn to Georgia, where again, Mark Zuckerberg. And we're starting to see more, billionaire money moving into our election system, aren't we? There's always a lot of talk about George Soros, but now we've got Zuckerberg, we've got Gates. I mean, this is really extraordinary. Give us a sense, if you will, of just why Zuckerberg was involved and what has been the result.
Sure. So he funded, by the tune of $350 million, a group called the Center for Tech and Civic Life. And that group started recruiting municipalities and counties around the country starting in May of this past year to offer them large amounts of money to help carry out a general election that was going to obviously be in the shadows of the COVID pandemic. What's interesting about it, the early documents I have seen through FOIAs and lawsuits and other things that have emerged indicate that they started by focusing on Democratic stronghold cities. For instance, they approached the Racine, Wisconsin mayor, that's a Democratic city inside of Republican County, and then asked them to work with Milwaukee, Madison, Green Bay, 3 very Democratic cities, to see if they also would like to take money from Mark Zuckerberg's group. And this money goes to pay poll workers. It goes to create ballot drop boxes. In some cases in Philadelphia, where they got $10 million from Mark Zuckerberg, not only did they pay for the staff, they set quotas that said you have to get 800,000 people to the polls in Philadelphia. You have to have at least 800 voting locations in order to qualify for the money.
Okay. So John Solomons is an exceptional investigative journalist and certainly has considerable clout and credibility. But he doesn't say it quite starkly enough. So let me paint the picture for you. Remember, the question is, what is the Democratic ground game? It's not a traditional one like the Republicans that canvass and registered voters. Or have rallies and mobilize their base, get them enthusiastic, get them to come out. They didn't focus on that, really. What they focused on was litigation, changing the rules at the last minute, okay? The reason for changing the rules is to allow for broader interpretation, a more leeway, more of an openness to allow in all these particular voter irregularities to occur, potential fraud, lots of mail-in ballots, all these things. They changed the rules at the last minute, but that's not enough. Now that they've created that legal framework, the question is, who's going to manage the process on November the 3rd? How are they going to manage that? So that using this newfound rule, the framework, how are they going to manage it so they can get in all these extra ballots at the last minute? This is where Zuckerberg and a lot of the big tech companies that use not-for-profit organizations to fund money to these various jurisdictions and counties which are Democratic strongholds, i.e., Philadelphia, certain places in Wisconsin and Michigan and in Georgia, funnel tons of money there to them so that these counties can hire people who are going to basically be equipped to make sure that the Democrats control the poll stations. The Democrats equip the poll stations with poll watchers, with vote counters, with personnel and security to ensure that they have the framework, the legal framework that they've worked to solidify will now be matched with a managing process so that they can, in the cover of night, suddenly have, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of ballots come in through the back door. And this is exactly what happened in PA and Georgia, right? They stopped the counting. They kicked out the Republican poll watchers if they even allowed them, which in most cases they didn't. And then they brought in all of these mail-in ballots, and only Democrats were allowed to watch and count. And they secured that by putting security guards in, barring Republicans. In fact, here's an interesting little video that was sent to me, and I think you should watch it right here. You see this gentleman here covering his face, this black gentleman wearing the gray suit. He's a security guard. These are all Republicans, and he's keeping them out. This is in Detroit, Michigan.
Come in. Will you let them in? You can't. Why not? COVID capacity. What COVID capacity?
Can you at least radio again and ask for more information?
Who told you not to disclose any information?
Can you at least radio and ask again if anything has changed?
I've been given back strength. Were you told not to let this particular group in?
There's 3 people that can go in because us 3 are coming out, so 3 people can go in. How about that?
He hasn't been doing that. No. Whoever comes out, he doesn't let people in. They're not keeping track of who's coming and going.
Just like them in counting ballots, they're not keeping track. They have no clue how many people are in there and how many. They have no clue. There's more Democrats in there. I'm going to tell you right now.
That's what we were told.
Mr. Sims, you mentioned COVID rules. Can you just tell us what COVID rules you're referring to?
No comment.
I'm asking you a third time. Will you let these people in? They've been sitting
the third, fourth, or fifth time. Still, if you want to say yes, no comment.
Again, there's 25 people up here on the roof of a building. Would you let them in?
No comment. Democrats are not letting us Republicans in, folks.
Okay, this security guard there, his name is Sims. This is in Detroit, Michigan. And as you heard the guy say, there's 25 Republicans out there, and there's 1 Democrat security guard. Well, I don't know if he's the Democrat. I have no idea. In fact, probably if we said he was a Democrat, the Democrats would deny it, and he would say, no, I'm not a Democrat operative. I'm not a party affiliated. But the point is this. The point is they were hired. They were hired by these counties that are Democrat strongholds, and they were hired through the money that was given to them by Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg and his not-for-profit organization, so that they could fulfill the second part of their ground game, right? They control and manage the situation, bar Republicans, get all these ballots in under the cover of night, start counting it secretly and behind. This is the kind of stuff that happens in banana republics. Now, the thing is, you got 25 Republicans and 1 security guard. I don't know why they didn't storm the place and insist on going in, but that's part of the problem. We Republicans are far too gentle. Conservatives are far too gentle, far too willing to play by these broken rules They change the rules in the game. They act malicious. They use the system against us, knowing because they know that we're basically decent, passive people, as those Republicans there in this video. They're just standing around complaining. Complaining isn't getting you anything. I don't know why they didn't storm this one guy and force their way in. At least that might have made the light of day. But anyways, so that was the second part of the ground game. Manage the process so that you can get in these fake ballots, these fraudulent ballots, these fraudulent votes to overwhelm the system. And then the third part of the prong, well, it's been the same thing since the beginning, since the get-go, and that's manage the messaging. Use the media. They're willing lackeys in the Republican establishment to maintain the idea that Joe Biden has won legitimately, and that there's no evidence of fraud. There's no evidence of illegitimate playing here. There's nothing to see here, folks. Move along, move along. Let's just be healed. Those willing lackey Republicans like Pat Toomey and Mitt Romney and the rest, I'm telling you, Republicans and conservatives, you ought to be thoroughly, verbally thrashing and trashing those senators. You should be invading their inbox, their mail inbox, their Twitter accounts, whatever, and just let them know they're finished. They are finished as far as their political careers are concerned. We're not going to stand and take it because they are part and parcel of this entire franchise of what Biden called well, let's hear his own words.
For this, we have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
Folks, why explain away when this guy is willing to be honest about it? He may have made a blundering mistake at that moment, but this is really what it's all about. This is the truth behind the veil. And thank God that he is senile and he's a little losing it, because it allows us to see really what's going on. He's not quite as sharp as he used to be with his lies. This is obviously the truth, though he spoke it in error, of what's really going on. And you got guys like Pat Toomey and Mitt Romney and Karl Rove and all of these, and George W. Bush and Jeb Bush, all of these morons are part and parcel of this. They may not be intimately connected to Joe Biden's fraud, but at least they're complicit in allowing it and not challenging it. So, my friends, have faith, but just to be clear about what's happened here. They had a ground game. Their ground game was first to litigate, change the rules of the game. Secondly, manage the process to allow fake ballots, fraudulent ballots to come in under the cover of night. And then thirdly, manage the messaging. And listen, stand for the truth. The truth will finally come through. The light of day will prevail and expose all of this fraud that we know is taking place. And Trump will remain president. That's my firm belief. And so keep the faith, everybody. Take care.